Hey everyone, Charles Herring here. I wanted to take a little bit of a deep dive on, is all 4K created equal? We have different streaming services. We still have Blu-rays that are lingering out there, and wanted to look at if I wanted to have the best experience, the most ideal experience for watching high sensory content. How would I do that? What should I be aware of? So I wanted to run through the different variables that go into a high quality streaming um, uh, experience, and how you can maximize your experience and what the current state of technologies are out there. So I'm going to do a little bit of an explanation, and then we're going to go through three different live experiments to test out some hypotheses on different streaming options. So the first thing I'll look at is just the variables that impact quality of what we're seeing. There are times when we are watching 4K content, but it doesn't feel like 4K content. We've paid for it, it says it's 4K, but it doesn't really feel like 4K content. And while we're not going to cover the feeling part, I'm not able to do the human component in this set of testing. We can look at the characteristics that likely contribute to that feel. The first is resolution, and we've known about resolution a long time when we were moving from VHS tapes to SD, to DVDs, and then into HD. We talk about the resolution, and the resolution is just the number of pixels that are able to generate light on a screen. So in DVDs, we tend to have 720 pixels wide by 480 pixels high, and that's all of the dots that are on the screen that you can change at any given moment. HD is the standard is 1920 by 1080 pixels, and 4K Ultra HD is 3840 by 2160. And there can be variability. It doesn't have to be that, and it's not always that. There are cinema reasons, filming reasons that are beyond me on the different aspect ratios, what's the height to width and all those things. So they do change. Frame rates are how often we draw a new picture per second. And the human eye can typically only reasonably see 12 to 15 changes per second. Anything beyond that, it's at least beyond the conscious part of our brain. DVDs tended to be encoded at about 30 frames per second. And almost all of the modern content is at 20 frames per second now, whether it's on Blu-ray or it's being transmitted streaming. Though that can change if if your TV and your receivers can support it. You can go to 60 or 120. So you sometimes see TVs that are rated at 120 hertz, and hertz is just cycles per second, which would essentially be frames per second in this case. But the area I really want to focus on most deeply in these experiments is around bit rate. Bitrate is this exchange of data from the content source to your eyeball, and everything in between. So it's reading this data, it's transmitting it across the network, it's being rendered by your TV or streaming device, and then that data that's been generated is coming into your eyeball. So the higher the amount of data, the higher the bit rate, the more color, the more depth, the higher the resolution. And in a lot of cases, you can have lower or higher resolution with a lower bit rate that's less quality than having lower resolution with a higher bit rate, because there's a difference in information exchange. The more information that's coming into our eyes is more interesting. It's deeper is the way that we feel. So a lot of this idea of feeling it's not 4K, in my hypothesis here, which I'm not going to be able to completely prove, is around bitrate, that how much data is coming in. So when we look at a DVD, it tended to be encoded at 3 megabits per second to 10 megabits per second. HD Blu-rays are around 20 to 30 megabits per second, and 4K Ultra HD is between 50 and 60 megabits per second. And if you're wondering why is there variability, it has a lot to do with the size, the length of the films. If you multiply the bit rate out, you're going to get a number for how much space. If you have an hour and a half film, you multiply that out at 3 megabits per second, that'll come out to something in a ballpark of 2 gigabytes, right? So if you needed to get, it would fit on something 2 gigabytes big. But if you think about really large, long movies like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, where the extended versions are approaching 4 hours, when you're running at a bit rate of 60 megabits per second, that's going to take more than 50 gigabytes. So you're going to have to actually split it across multiple disks. So there are times when the manufacturers of the Blu-rays will reduce the bit rate so that they don't have to use a second Blu-ray to roll it out. So that's pretty much one of the biggest factors. So when I talk about lossless or uncompressed data, I'm talking about what's on a Blu-ray, which is the best we have access to. It's not the best if we were in the studio and had access to the raw footage. But we're typically looking at 60 megabits per second sort of being the peak, the best amount of data, the highest amount of data that we can get in 4K currently. So when you're just looking at what does that mean per hour, bits per second, a second's a second, we tend to live in hours when we're talking about movies and TV. And a lot of the content we're watching the streaming tends to be in the 3 megabits per second range, which seems like that's pretty low considering full 4K is supposed to be 60 megabits per second, or would be 60 megabits per second if you're reading it off a Blu-ray. But even at 3 megabits per second, you just consumed 1.4 gigabytes of data that was read off a disk at the streaming provider, sent over the network, and then given to your eyes. And there's a lot of compression that goes into this, and the compression is trying to pick what things to remove or merge so that it minimizes a negative impact to your experience. But obviously it's removing things, it's merging things, it's reducing the total that we're receiving. But it sort of has to. When you look at 50 megabits per second, that's 22.5 gigabytes coming in to your home, being processed by your network, being displayed on your screen. It's an enormous amount of data, which is expensive for you, but for the streaming provider, obviously, it's bonkers expensive if they're doing that to every screen and every home of all of their customers. But when we look at what's the impact, what's the big deal? Compression, obviously, ton of upside, cheaper for the streamer, which means it's potentially cheaper for me, it's cheaper on my network, I need less hardware and network to deal with it. But what do we lose? And it basically falls into two things. We lose some resolution, and the amount of resolution loss is dependent on the amount of compression. And then we also have color that's lost. When we look at resolution loss, what typically happens in the algorithms is, let's say you have an area of the screen that's 10 pixels by 10 pixels, a pretty small area. And if it was uncompressed, you would have 100 pieces of data, a piece of data per pixel. But when the compression algorithm analyzes that 10 by 10, it can say, hey, I can sort of merge some of these together and just generate 30 pieces of data to represent that 10 by 10. So go from 100 to 30. And so you end up getting, the effect on the human eye is some things seem blurry or blocky, where you sort of lose resolution, maybe not across the entire screen, but in certain sections of the screen. And color loss is similar kind of issue. If any of you remember watching the Winterfell episode in Game of Thrones, where the White Walkers come down, and it was just basically an hour and a half of fighting in the dark. It was hard to see. There were a ton of complaints because most of us were watching it via streaming because the Blu-rays weren't out at the time. We didn't have much of a choice. And so when you start compressing data, we start losing sharpness. The dark on dark, the black on black differences merge together, and it becomes this big, ugly black blob that happens in the algorithms. And the same thing's true with other colors, where you have a shade where it's called chroma subsampling, to where this shade's not different enough from this shade, so we sort of merge it together into a combination of those colors. So the short of all that is compression can greatly reduce things in a way that the human brain's not going to notice most of the things taken out or the things that are merged together, but we are giving up information. We're giving up precision information, which does lead to this feeling, especially if it's overdone. It will lead to this feeling of, this doesn't feel like 4K at all, this barely feels any different than HD. So I'm going to run 3 experiments today. The first one I'm going to run is I'm going to take the 4K version of Oppenheimer, and I'm going to stream it through Amazon, and then I'm going to compare the bitrate, frame rate, and resolutions that I get from that to a lossless, uncompressed version that I made from the Blu-ray. So I just took the Blu-ray and basically copied it onto my computer. Then I'm streaming it using Plex. Second experiment we'll run, it won't have the control of using the same content because the same content is not available on all the streaming services, but we're going to look at what does bit rate, resolution, and frame rate look like comparatively across the uncompressed nature on my Plex server, Disney Plus, Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon. And then we're going to look at HD streaming so we can compare how much better is HD on these streaming services versus what they look like in 4K. So a couple of notes on how I've set up this lab. I'm using a 4 gigabit per second fiber internet connection. I have an Amazon Fire TV Cube, the newest generation, that is Amazon's top tier streaming device, so it has the best hardware for generating content. It is plugged in on a wired connection directly into the internet router, so there's no Wi-Fi, there's no extra hops. It's minimized on all of the restraints on all the constraints would happen on networking. The Fire TV Cube is plugged into an Ultra HD 4K Sony television. I'm going to measure the bitrate, frame rate, and resolution using Developer Tools menu, which is available on all of the Android and Amazon Fire TV devices. And so it's just going to be an overlay that's going to read out the current settings as I'm playing the different content. I used Make MKV, which is a software suite to rip the Blu-ray to the Plex server. You can grab those links off this deck or off my website at charlesherring.com. All of the subscription services are at the top tier, so it's the 4K, all the bells and whistles are enabled on all of these services. And all of the streaming devices and all of the applications have been configured to use the highest bit rate and stream at the highest bit rate wherever those settings are available. All right, so first one we're going to run, the Oppenheimer 4K, so same content, exact same content. One's coming off a Blu-ray that's on the Plex server, another one's going to stream through the Amazon streaming service. We're going to see which one has the higher bit rate. Basic hypothesis is Amazon can't afford to foot the bill for 22.5 gigabytes per hour or 50 meg BPS, and so they're going to use some heavy compression that's going to reduce the bit rate to reduce their costs to themselves and to me. So I'm going to go kick off this first experiment, and I'll see you as soon as I get to the TV. All right, a slight change of plans here. YouTube did not like me doing the demo where I'm capturing snippets of the movies that I was testing against. So I'm going to have to take the demo out. But you can look at the links online for how I performed that, so I can make the algorithmic lawyers happy. So anyway, let's go ahead and get to the results. Wow. The results much different than I expected. Pretty much nothing I expected outside of the bitrate being lower turned out to be true. So one of the big findings was Netflix has a very low bit rate when it comes to 4K. I mean, if you know, it was running about 5% of what we would get off a Blu-ray. So Netflix is somehow giving up 95% of the bit rate. One thing it does have going for it is using the AV01 codec, which is more efficient than the HEVC, which most other things are using. But that codec's only 30% better. It's not 300% better. So they are using high tech, they're leveraging it, but they're really reducing their costs, which I think speaks volumes to why their stock price is the only one looking good in the streaming world right now. So they are definitely leaning into reducing the amount of data flowing in. So at 4K, you were seeing 3 megabits per second at peaks. And the way I measured this was, there were valleys, as there was different data. I looked at action movies. I looked at um, different types of content to see if I could get different results. But we would have these peaks and valleys on the streaming services where the baseline of the Plex movies on 4K would just pretty much go between 50 and 70 megabits per second, where we would see wide peaks where I would see things going down to 1 megabits per second on these things that were peaking up to 15 megabits per second. So I was trying to give the benefit of the doubt to these services. But Netflix, very surprising that its 4K content is really running at 3 megabits per second. Mind-blowing, frankly. So they were definitely in last place for a good place to watch your content. Apple and Prime both had access to my Oppenheimer license, my purchase. So I was able to watch Oppenheimer on Prime, Apple, and on Plex. So on Plex, I got the 65 megabits per second. That was perfect, no complaints, of course. That was the Blu-ray streaming directly from Plex with no compression. Prime came in at about 15 megabits per second, which looks like that's their hardwired limit for what they're going to do on 4K is 15 meg bps. They're using the HEVC codec, which is the standard codec. Is the same one that was being used on Plex with the Blu-ray, so no surprises there. But Apple came in much lower than Prime, and that was surprising to me, particularly given Apple's Gucci label brand image, to see that they were only coming in at 15% of 4K Max, where Prime came in at 23% on the same content. So that was apples to apples, where on Oppenheimer Plex 65, on Prime 15, and on Apple 10. Looking at other 4K content, Hulu actually came in as the best streaming. It was having consistent 16 meg peaks, so a little bit better than Prime, and a few times stayed at that level much more consistently than I was seeing with Prime. So the best data rates on 4K was with Hulu. Disney, I could not get 4K to switch over on any content. I was seeing this IMAX experience on HD. Nothing was annotated as 4K or Ultra HD. So everything ran at HD on Disney, which was surprising. Another thing that's surprising is their content streaming off of the AVC codec, which is the predecessor to the HEVC. So it's the oldest compression. Their HD was the best. Disney had the best HD streaming at 10 megabits per second, but again, it was 10 megabits per second on an older codec that was the least efficient at compression. So Disney and Apple, you sort of expect higher quality with the brands, turned out not to be true with either one of those. And Netflix is just, I think, most heavily leaning in to saving the nickels, making the quarterlies, and their HD was the lowest. So Netflix by far had the lowest 4K and the lowest HD at 1 megabit per second. When we look at the ratio of what the bit rate is from Ultra HD to HD, the Blu-rays that I was testing against had a 2.1 ratio. So we had 65 meg bps on 4K and about 31 meg bps on HD, so about 2.1, that's the baseline. One thing, all of the services except for Apple and Disney, which I couldn't get Ultra HD to work, have a higher than baseline ratio, which means when you jump from their HD content to their Ultra HD content, it's you're getting more than you should. The jump is bigger than it should be. So in the case of Prime, looking at their HD content, it was running at 3 megabits per second consistently almost across everything. But you got a 5x jump when you went to their 4K content. So the biggest jump was there on Prime. And then 3.2 for Netflix and Hulu. and then Apple was 1.3. There was virtually no difference in 4K content and HD content for Apple. So when you look at the numbers, the best case was Hulu on 4K, where they only gave up 75% of the bit rate, so they kept 25% of the bit rate. The worst was Netflix. That gave away 95% of the bit rate, only doing 4% of 4K max. So it was at 75 to 95% range. And then on HD, the best performer was Disney, so they were at 32%. But again, the caveat there is they're running on a less efficient compression codec, so probably balances out there. So ton of several surprises there. It was good. Hulu is the workhorse here. Apparently Netflix is the penny pincher in the picture. Apple and Disney coming up really way well below what I expected. So piecing all that together, if you're looking for the best experience, particularly in 4K or even in HD, the optical media still is the way to go. We've got 75% to 95% loss in bit rate when we're talking about going from the physical media out to streaming. The best case is you're going to lose 75% of the data, the bit rate. The secondary finding was, except for Apple, the jump from HD to Ultra HD is much bigger than you get on the Blu-ray. So that's encouraging, which probably indicates there's more investment on the Ultra HD side for the streamers currently, except for Apple. And the other thing that I really wasn't expecting to see was it's just all over the place on the quality of the stream that's coming from the streamers. And Netflix being the most frugal in how many bits they're giving you, Hulu being the most generous, and then just the gambit in between. So really interesting to see. But I would say if you're going to have a movie night or a marathon, if you can get the Blu-rays, whether they're 4K or HD Blu-rays, you're going to have the best experience. If you want to load those onto a media server like Plex using a program like MakeMKV to rip them on, that could help facilitate, prevent you from having to swap them out. But with the current state of where streaming is, you're going to lose, on a good day, 75% of your data if you're streaming it as opposed to taking it off optical media. And the last thing I'll say here is, while I proved, in this testing, or at least the data supported, that bit rate is horribly degraded when you stream over optical media, it doesn't prove that that's actually why we feel like we're being gypped on the 4K. So that human component still needs to be tested out, because the codecs may be good enough to trick us. Maybe that AV01 codec that Netflix is using and only is so much better that they only need that 3 megabits and we don't notice. And so there's a lot in here, but certainly just focusing in on bit rate in this conversation, we are getting gypped out of a lot of bit rate, and how much bit rate we get is sort of all over the board. So hope this is helpful. Do your own testing, and if you're going to have a movie night and a date night, might need to go old school and crack open the Blu-ray player. If you have any questions, you can find me on social media and or post the comments on charlesherring.com. Thanks for the time.